Hello and welcome back to Well That Aged Well. And for a third time, he is back with Adrian Murdoch, who has written Echoes of Ash, Life in Herculaneum. I'm probably going to say that wrong a couple of times, so do forgive the horrible pronunciation. And as I say, he's back a third time, and again, third time is always the charm, as they say. And last time he was on, we discussed a famous meme that was going on, and it's already been 3 years. And we were discussing how much do you think about the Roman Empire? And I gotta ask for a good old fashion, good old time's sake, how much do you think about the Roman Empire?
Pretty much all the time. And thank you for having me back on the show again.
Thank you for sending
But
me a book. It was a great pleasure.
no, I pretty much think about the Roman Empire continuously and all the time. I've just come back from Greece, where I was. The connections between Herculaneum and Greece are very, very tight, and I wanted to check out some of the connections there. So yeah, I
Maybe we
think
can
about.
talk about it this episode.
Sorry.
Maybe we can talk about that as well this episode, that maybe
I
not in
think
the
so.
book.
Why
And
not?
speaking of, Herculaneum may not be familiar to many. Certainly, I'm one of them that it was kind of in the shadow until your book came out. And obviously, it's overshadowed by this bigger brother, so to speak, Pompeii. So, but let's begin, and it actually did fall under the same volcanic Vesuvius when it exploded in 79 AD. The Herculaneum suffered the same fate as Pompeii. Let's begin with the name itself. It's kind of obvious where it got its name from. So let's talk about the name and the name where it came from. Herculaneum is obviously, is short the background is back to the Greek god Hercules. So let's talk about the name in itself to begin with.
Yes, the city was, as myths always say, founded by Hercules on his way back to Greece from trashing huge amounts of Europe. His spirit, if I can put it that way, is all over the city. You cannot move without seeing references to him everywhere. And it's interesting that the main statue of the greatest civilian in the city, Marcus Nonius Balbus. If you look at the statue of him, which was on the main square, it was the most important city. He has a badge of Hercules on his chest. But if you look at the art, I mean, half of the art, I'm exaggerating, but not by a great deal, are pictures of Hercules in one form or another. He is absolutely everywhere.
Mm. So let's begin. I know kind of the ending of the book, but I want to begin with excavation and the finding of
Yeah.
Herculaneum as well, because it was, I'm from my recollection, it was kind of a happy accident in a way, and I've also talked about some of the problems of excavating the area as well, because there is a giant giant problem that is in the way above the old Herculaneum. So let's begin with the excavation and the finding of the city. Was it before the finding? Was it well-known city until the excavation began, or was it kind of in like, did and were people unaware of that it actually had existed at all before the excavations?
There are two stories here that happened simultaneously. If you believe the traditional story, it was completely forgotten. If you go along that route, it was Emmanuel Maurice de Lorraine, the Prince d'Elbeuf, who was digging beneath one of his palaces, or just in the courtyard of one of his palaces at night, sometime in 1711. We don't have a more precise date than that, though we suspect it's later in the year. And he discovered, or one of his workers discovered, the three Herculaneum women and brought them out of the earth. It's a fantastic story, and from then on, it was clear something was going to happen. There was something there. They did some more digging, and by 1739, the site was identified as Herculaneum. This came from an inscription that was found. That's the official story. The reality is that all of this is complete nonsense, and people knew all along where the town was. I have to be very careful. It's a town and not a city. It was very different and much smaller to Pompeii. If you partly, of course, the city was completely subsumed by the volcanic ash, but people knew where it was. There is a fantastic map that survived from the fourth century called the Tabula, the Poiteringer tablet, which is now in the library in Vienna, which dates to the fourth century. And if you look at Italy, Herculaneum is still marked, and people knew where it was. It was also known fairly consistency as a place where, if you dug in the ground, you will probably find a statue. But that isn't a very glamorous story. And so we much prefer this story
Mm.
of the 18th century and digging down and finding these mysterious women. Um, that story itself turns into almost a spy story because they couldn't be taken out of Italy. So they were smuggled to Rome and then smuggled to Vienna. And they were kept there illegally and given to Eugene of Savoy. This was in the Belvedere, which was is the other palace that people visit outside the city. And when he died without children, it went to the Skulptursammlung in Dresden, which is where they still are. It's a fantastic story, and these are magnificent emblems. Where the story is true is that's where Herculaneum became popular. I mean, the Herculaneum women cannot be underestimated. They have shaped the way that we regard femininity in the classical world. The famous art critics like Joachim Winckelmann in the late 18th century, early 19th century, described them as some of the most beautiful women and paragons of virtue ever seen. So the city wasn't properly discovered then, but it was properly refound. There was a renaissance of the city, if you want to put it like that.
Now, in each chapter, you dedicate to certain individuals,
Yeah.
and we will take a look at some of them. So let's begin, as you do in the book, with the soldier that has his last day and last stand at the beach of Herculaneum, and in the final days of Herculaneum.
He is probably the best known body to be found. The bodies, pardon me, were all found in the early 80s. And much of the initial work on them was done by a paleontologist called Sarah Bissell, and many of the names come from her. He makes a logical point to start the book because we know where he was found on the beach. He was very much in the center, and you can see where his body was discovered after it was hit by the pyroclastic flow. And he's very obviously a soldier. Many of the others, we don't know, their clothes didn't survive, and this, that,
Mm.
and the other. But with him, you know exactly what he is. You've got his sword, which is in beautiful condition. You've got what I've called a sporran, but the protective belt that went round his waist. You've got the other sword. It's a very logical place for him to have been. He was clearly the object of relief efforts. Now, did he come to the city on the boat that was also found? We don't know. It's rife for speculation.
Was he trying
But
to escape the volcanic ashes that,
yeah,
had came down?
either way, he headed up the relief effort. It's interesting to see a real person, and of course, we're in the realms of speculation. But you can make some sensible decisions and thoughts about the man.
Now, when it came to soldiers during the volcanic outbreak
Hmm.
in 79 AD, what were, I'm gonna do kind of a comparison to Titanic for, it might be a weird comparison, but you see the workers there, they had to make sure everyone got to safety before they themselves could get on. Was it the same case for soldiers? Did they have in Herculaneum, did they had to first ensure the civilian population got out to safety first? What were what did they have a specific how much time did they have, to do this, on a sinking ship or say sinking city in so to speak? Was there much time did they have for rescue in this case, or didn't they have time at all to do this?
That's a very interesting question. We don't know is the short answer, but the parallel with Titanic isn't exact because they knew that the
Yeah.
Titanic was going to collapse. What was interesting about Herculaneum was that the town did not appear in danger. You'd seen some of the volcanic ash fall,
Mm.
the pumice come down, but it had only landed a couple of centimeters. By this stage in Pompeii and the other cities, it was considerably more dangerous. Walls were coming in, roofs were starting to collapse. In Herculaneum, it wasn't. And there's no sign of danger. I mean, if you think about it, to get an entire population or a
Yeah.
significant population down to the beach, you can go down the staircase that they came down.
And
Um,
even, as I mentioned in the book as well, even
yeah.
if the volcano if Pompeii is exploding today, it would also still be in the 21st century a logistical nightmare to get everyone out.
But we didn't know, Herculaneum
Mm.
didn't know what was about to happen. So they got down to the beach fairly carefully. The presumption, and I think it's a fair presumption, is that the soldier was there to get people out by boat.
Mm.
Only one boat has been found. That's not to say that there weren't others coming. He wasn't arranging for others to escape. We found over 300 bodies, so it clearly means that there was expectation of relief. So people were there and they were waiting. Clearly, the soldier was coordinating efforts. One of the other people I mentioned as well, the boxer,
Yeah,
he
we
was
will come back to
clearly,
him later.
yeah, he was clearly there for a significant reason as well. He was also an object on the beach that people were looking up to. And again, it's not too much of a leap of faith to suggest that he was helping the soldier coordinate.
Speaking of rescue, of course, you mentioned the Pliny family as well, who were present in. So let's talk about the Pliny's. I don't remember if the younger or the elder rescue attempt in an attempt to be heroic as well. So let's talk about their involvement in this also.
It is interesting seeing their approach. It fairly recently, and by fairly recently I mean last year, the his villa was plausibly identified further down the coast. Pliny the Younger, the one that we know from the letters, decided to stay in. He didn't want to get out of his bedroom. He was 17. I described it as typical teenager
Yeah.
behavior. You go and do that. I'm going to stay here. His uncle had been a significant character in the Roman. He'd been very important in Roman Germany and in the gradual civilization of Roman Germany. He'd written the history of Germany, but he was now in his 50s. So he had a slightly honorary title in charge of the fleet. We can only imagine how seriously he was taken in the way that people who are effectively retired, often are. But it was Pliny the Elder who had taken the boats and gone to the rescue. Now, he didn't make it as far as Herculaneum. He made it to another place. We're not quite sure where that is. And what we have is this eyewitness account from his nephew of what it looked like, what the eruption, how the eruption happened, and where he was at the time.
Mm. So something I want to talk about as well. The next thing is, you mentioned it was a town and not rather than cities. And let's talk a little bit about Herculaneum, the town, and how, and I want to prepare it a little bit about Pompeii as well, but let's talk a little bit about how it was laid out and what do we know about Herculaneum as a town.
Well, the crucial bit that we always have to remember is only about a quarter of the city has been excavated. Now, in Pompeii is very different. Deliberately and with very forward thinking, it was decided in the 19th century and in the 20th century only to excavate the city part by part, because older archaeologists knew that there'd be changes in how discoveries happened. They knew that there'd be technical advances in looking things up. That's fine. That doesn't exist in Herculaneum. And as you sort of mentioned at the beginning, the biggest problem is that the town of Herculaneum
Mm.
sits on top of
Makes
the
very difficult for archaeological diggings.
hugely. As an archaeologist, very selfishly, it's like get rid of the people we want to dig
Yeah.
this properly. And it is unfair to complain what we don't have because we have so much. But we should acknowledge that a lot of the city hasn't been dug up. We've only got about a quarter of the city, and there's huge amounts that's missing. I mean, this morning I was reading an article about the water. Now we've got a couple, we've got some of the pipes, we know where some of the water towers were, but we don't have the central unit, which was typically at the tallest part of the tallest part of the town, which is where the water then dispersed to the whole city. We don't have the harbour. The harbour was clearly very important to Herculaneum as well. We don't have that either.
Mm.
So we should be excited about what we have. But it's of course very easy to complain about what we don't have.
Yeah. Now, I want to talk something I found fascinating about the book, and it's just a little part, but I want to bring it up anyway. Is the idea that Christianity was a part of Herculaneum, and we must remember that Christianity hasn't really taken that much off yet because there's found crosses in
Yeah.
archaeological digging, and of course, crosses is not necessarily just associated with Christianity, but we want to have something to associate with I guess for the city. So let's talk about the social presence of Christianity in Herculaneum.
And I should be clear, there is no evidence at all for Christianity in Herculaneum. People got very excited. And Amadeo Mauri, who ran the
Mm.
site from the 20s until the 60s, who was phenomenal, thought that there was a cross, and thought that this showed the sign of uh, early Christianity. It was one of the earliest signs that there were. It is complete and utter nonsense, and it has been got rid of. There is what looks like the sign of a cross on the wall, but that is the sign actually of where a shelf held up. And we can say that fairly plausibly that within 40 years, it's unlikely that Christianity made much headway
Yeah.
across the Mediterranean to that extent, and the cross was not used as a symbol in the first century. However, and I say the big however here, there is evidence of possibly Jewish life.
Yeah.
I think it's a step too far to say Jewish community, but there was Jewish life. We have signs of a David, graffiti of a David, and we have graffiti of a Maria.
Mm.
So clearly there were people of that stage. More
Yeah, and
interesting.
something that you mentioned as well is that graffiti was quite different back then to what we think of graffiti on the
Yeah.
city walls today, as you mentioned in the book as well.
And I think the graffiti is one of the most interesting aspects because you get a sign of real people. Paper was expensive and this, that, and the other. And there've been complaints that some of the references are well, they're the obvious bits of the Aeneid, they're the obvious
Mm.
bits of the Iliad. And I think, well, it points to a literate society in which you could throw a line from the Aeneid or the Aeneid, a line from the Iliad out, and people would be expected to know what it is. Um, but they're also real. You get a sense of people, they want sex, they're
Yeah.
complaining about people stealing their clothes. They're it's indication of real life, and you have the formality of Cicero, and Cicero has obviously been edited, and we have this very polished jurist, lawyer, stylist who exists, and maybe the same with Cicero. They're what people wanted to see, whereas this is
Mm.
people's thoughts. And I've made the analogy that they are the tweets of the
Yeah.
ancient world, which is a bit of a cute description, and nobody really uses Twitter anymore since it is uh, change and become an echo chamber for politics. Um, but that kind of instant thought and instant reaction to what's going on, I think is really interesting because you can hear what the locals are thinking, what's going on, even if it's just people notching up how many beers they'd had or how many glasses of wine they'd had at a party.
Mm. Another thing I found rather fascinating was the use of sewage as archaeological findings as well. And it's true in this case, another man's trash is another man's treasure. So let's go into the point of sewage being
Yeah.
such an importance for archaeological diggings.
The It's one of the most exciting discoveries. There is a brilliant scholar called Erica Rowan, who has
I,
been doing work on this.
I mean, I
Um,
can only hope someone will dig up my poo on the shit in 1,000 years time.
well, yes, because it will give indications of what you ate. Um, and
Not very healthy, I will admit.
what's interesting is it shows the variety of what was eaten. And there is a slight stereotype, and I mentioned this in the book that if you were upper class, you lived off dormice, and if you were lower class, you lived off bread and olive oil. What the sewage shows is there was a vast variety of food, and it was international. That's the bit that gets me. If you look at what they ate, it wasn't that far removed, if you take out tomatoes and potatoes, from the Italian diet today. You've got dates, which were obviously imported from the Middle East. You've even got pepper, which came in from India. You have a huge variety of poultry. You've got types of breads. You've got all kinds of wheats. There are nuts, and the variety of the fish that are eaten, puts modern days to shame. It was a
Mm.
good diet.
I mean, it didn't have all the junk food that we have today, to be fair.
There is that. There's no Roman version of McDonald's.
Mm. So the next person I want to talk about is, and I don't know if you have time for all of them, but short woman is another
Yes.
person that you talk about as well. So who was she, and where does she fit in the picture of Herculaneum?
The And I have used her to describe the various objects of religion around the town. What is interesting in history and the way we now look back at history is if you go to the 19th century, people wanted the great man story of history. So it was big names. We care about Julius Caesar. We don't care about normal
Mm.
people.
Yeah.
That has thankfully changed a lot since the 80s.
Like you said, you care in the book. You care mostly about the upper class, or the real,
Yeah,
absolutely lower. The middle has been
yeah,
completely ignored in historiography.
exactly, exactly. And she's a good example of somebody who wouldn't life wasn't good to her, especially
Mm.
she wasn't especially happy. She hadn't had a good diet, and I think it's good to throw lights onto these people. I have connected her to religion, possibly slightly fictitiously, because I thought, well, what else can she have looked forward to in her life? She had bad teeth. She wasn't especially healthy. Looking to the afterlife is maybe something that she would have done, and it was a kind of cute introduction, and for a writer to do so. Um, we need to remember that there were people like that. Inevitably,
Mm.
historians want the sexy stories. It's people who've done stuff. Um, Here's an example of somebody who really didn't do very much.
Mm. I remember Mary Bird had a documentary where she talked about living conditions in Rome and how they were how pretty much everyone who were poor were huddled up in with 5 to 6 people, I think, or more,
Yeah.
in a Roman flat on turf floor or something. It was nice to be rich in ancient Rome, but being poor was maybe not so fun as the other classes in that society.
Well,
I think it's still true for today, but even maybe worse back in antiquity.
it wouldn't have been a barrel of laughs, but and this is possibly a small thing to hang on to. Um, Other parts of the world have much worse weather. So it's very,
Yeah.
very clear that your home, your house wasn't necessarily a place of refuge. It was a place where you slept. Life, work, everything else happened out on the
Mm.
street. But one of the interesting, I hope, points that I make about childbirth was that if you're in a room with 5 or 6 people, or you're all living closely together, there aren't many mysteries of childbirth. There aren't many mysteries of life that go around. And the story that upset me and still upsets me is that letter from Pliny the Younger about when he calls his wife an idiot for miscarrying a child. It's a very, very depressing story.
Mm.
His wife will not necessarily have had the same access and the group of people around her to be able to know what was going on. It's a very sad insight into
Mm.
uh, people living at that level possibly had it slightly better, or at least they had more knowledge.
And also, you mentioned a tweet among academics and scholars of antiquity that, what would you think were the cause of death if, you lived in ancient Rome? And most women would say childbirth, that it was very high risk of dying in childbirth as well. And I think, wasn't the wife of Pompey the one first, his first wife, didn't she die in childbirth as well?
I remember that tweet very, very vividly because you could see every male academic get pumped up, and it was everybody was Marcus Decimus Maximus. I am the father of a murdered son, husband of a
Yeah.
murdered wife, and everyone wanted to be
Die
leading
there
the
around the
legion
arena.
somewhere, and this, that, and the other. And I vividly remember it was a female academic
It's
from
interesting how
America.
no one said old age in that tweet. It's
No.
interesting to say no old age in that tweet.
And just seeing female academic after female academic after saying childbirth, childbirth, childbirth was the much needed
Wake
bucket
up
of
call.
water. Yeah, that was needed. Um,
Yeah.
we
So,
we romanticize the
mm,
past, and it's still something that people do. I mean, I remember I've been asked many times would I like to go back and live in Roman times, and the answer is no, of course not. I've got
mm,
central
maybe
heat.
visit for a holiday, but for a few days. But
Exactly. I've got central heating. I've got penicillin. I've got
yeah,
the internet. I'm fine. Don't want any of that kind of nonsense.
yeah. So, and the next thing, the
Hmm.
next person on the list, of course, is the boxer, and so that now we're going to the sport area of
Yeah.
the part. So let's talk about the famous boxer as well. You mentioned him earlier, and so let's talk a little bit about him in greater detail.
He is fascinating. I mean, we are reliant on one academic called Luigi Capasso, who published the analysis of the of every body. Of every body that was found in as much detail as he could, um,
How could you
and
tell he was a boxer as well? It's a follow-up question, I guess.
again, it's supposition, but it's plausible supposition. You can tell from the attacks on the face, the fact that he had a large physical stature. It's a it's fairly safe guess to make. Um, Again, he would have been a local hero. The Romans looked up to to their sports stars. Gladiator sweat was sold as the equivalent of the female equivalent of Viagra in Rome itself. Um, so they were famous within the community,
They
and
weren't respected very much, but they were famous.
they were famous and looked up to an extent. And with boxers, we have enough statues of boxers, and we have enough masks and so on to get the idea. I think it's fairly safe to say they were well known as important members of the community.
Mm. So, and you mentioned as well, he was very present in the famous Roman baths as
Yeah.
well. So let's talk a little bit about the Roman bath in this in context as well.
The baths in Herculaneum are probably the most visited part of the town because they're so well preserved and really, really, really well looked after. If you are British, you get very used to seeing Roman history as maybe ankle high.
Mm.
You don't get much more than that. Suddenly, you walk in to whole structures. with roofs and everything, and that never stops being boring. But when you see the design, I keep being blown away by the design of the changing rooms. The
Mm.
male changing rooms have got a curious roof design, and I didn't understand why they had this roof design like that. And it's to keep the condensation from dripping on people as they're changing. It's incredibly forward thinking. And the baths themselves and the floors are wonderful to look at, even more so in the women's baths, which are, much smaller. Bathing was obviously segregated in Rome. They could sort of, play with rules a little bit, but in the provinces, they were more conservative, and the baths, the female baths, are beautiful to look at. The mosaics on the floor are stunning. They make the points. They refer to the fact that this is the sea. They're beautiful to look at. They were clearly in use all the time. Um, uh, no wonder that they're the most popular bit of the city.
Mm. Now, as well, I want to talk a little bit about the health because I think I remember reading somewhere that Roman baths weren't necessarily healthy, then and that that you could get some diseases from going to the bath as well.
That's true. It depends on the baths and it depends on drainage. Now, since the water was connected to Herculaneum in the first century BCE, they had running water all of the time. If you're looking at, say, the military baths in Germany, they're the first ones that come to mind. They didn't have outflow, so essentially you were washing yourself in the same bath water as an awful lot of people. The scope for picking up illnesses was pretty significant. In a town like Herculaneum, where the baths were good and there was constant running water, so not the baths from the first century BCE. Before then, I mean, after the water and the aqueduct was connected, actually they will have kept you fit and healthy. It was the only scope you really had to wash yourself.
Well, one of the persons you mentioned in the book as well with rather great influence is Marcus Nonius Balbus the
Yes.
Younger, and I wanted to wait with him until now, but I feel we have to talk about him and his role as po in politics and in Herculaneum as well.
It's very easy, and I to mock him, and I have sort of gone through the process of laughing at him. He was a minor official. He is
Well, was
mentioned.
he kind of a Trump of his day in a way?
I'm not even sure he was advanced as that. I use the analogy that in many British county towns, they have a statue up to an industrialist who did something. And that's very much how I think of him. I mean, he was not hugely important. He gets one name check in, I think, as his Dio. And he was governor of Cyrene and of Crete. But, and that but is in large capital letters, he looked after the town. He built various halls. The thing that we often forget about all of the cities in that were damaged by Vesuvius is that there was a huge damage to them beforehand. They were all damaged in 62. So what's that, 50, 60 years earlier, by an earthquake. And Marcus Aurelius Balbus stepped up and he paid for an awful lot of repairs. So he shouldn't be mocked. It's easy to sit there and go, ah, yes, he's a big fish in a small pond and he's doing this, that, and the other. But actually, he did look after the town. And yes, of course, he had the seat at the theatre that was named for him. Of course, he rebuilt
I mean, what politicians didn't at the time?
and don't continue now. I mean, of course they
Mm.
do. He was, I think, a good thing in the grand scheme of things.
You mentioned the earthquake, and I want to talk about that
Yeah,
one as well because it's kind of big event, and it was still rebuilding by the time Vesuvius, not
yeah.
Pompeii, but Vesuvius exploded. So let's talk about the earthquake and what the consequences of that, the natural disaster.
It occurred about 17 years. My maths is caught up. 17 years before Vesuvius erupted. It was significant. It was really, really, really damaging. I've mentioned in the book that we have some indications from sculptural evidence, pictures of quite how bad it was. There's an almost humorous one of a cart being thrown around and one of the temples falling down. Um, but we shouldn't forget, hang on, that was significant. Um, we can get a sign of how bad things were by the damage to people's teeth. Clearly, sort of people who were young at the time didn't have enough food around then. So there was damage to the food supply, clearly major damage to buildings. Again, Marcus Nonis Balbus stepped up and seemed to have repaired an awful lot. But it was significant again for the emperor. Vespasian stepped up and paid for repairs to the town. And Vespasian was known as an accountant, and he wasn't someone who was prepared to throw money around ridiculously. So if he is passing cash, then there's a good reason for it.
Hmm. Let's start before we go into the next
Yeah,
person. I want to ask about you mentioned Vespasian, and that
yeah.
brought me to the question: how important was Herculaneum as a city in the grand scheme, or town in the grand scheme of the Italy or the empire?
It wasn't. And that's, I think, what makes it so interesting. It was slightly significant in that a number of famous people had holiday homes around the area, and it was where people would go to escape Rome at the height of summer, to some extent. Um, it was important enough for the aqueducts to be put in. They wanted the water to come in. And I think that is a big thing as something they liked it. But if you look at Herculaneum itself, there is no one famous who comes from there. I mean, no one was born there that we know was. It wasn't this kind of famous birthplace and cult of the emperor. No emperor was born there. There weren't any writers who especially hung out there.
It wasn't a significant commercial hub.
No, no. It was where you went on holiday, above all else.
Mm. It was kind of like what you think of Ibiza in a way, or places like that of the day.
Well, the Hamptons in New York is kind of the closest parallel.
Mm.
It was close enough to the major center of Rome for people to be able to sort of go there. I mean, we know Cicero, for example, had a home in the area, and famous writers did turn up and spend some time there. But in and of itself, it wasn't a crucial place. And I think that makes it almost more interesting because had it been the birthplace of an emperor or something, you'd be dealing with the cult of the emperor that came about and all the other things that happened. Instead, you have an organic town growing. This is what real people did.
Mm. I'd rather do an obvious comparison to Pompeii, and so let's talk about the elephant in the room and compare it to the much more famous city, if you will. And now you said it's and less is more time. We kind of talked about the important, but we have to kind of do a comparison to Pompeii. So it's kind of
Yeah,
they are kind of neighbors in a way.
they are. And I want to emphasize the book wasn't written to put one team against another, if you can put it like that. It was simply to put the spotlight back on Herculaneum. It's a different
Mm,
town, different things. Pompeii was a fully functioning city. It it is big. It was about 4 times the size. Herculaneum had, and this is, back of an envelope maths, but Herculaneum had a population of around 5,000 people. Pompeii was around 20,000. Um, just in terms of size, there's nothing to compare the two of them. Pompeii
other
was
than
a,
the fact that they suffered the same fate initially.
they did. And we can get on to why Pompeii is better known, apart from it not just because of its size. It is a much, much easier site to excavate. Um, if you go and look at Herculaneum, you are faced with meters and meters and meters of effectively concrete that had to be removed before you get to look at any of the city. In Pompeii, it's volcanic, pumice stone. It's much easier to dig. Um, uh, and it's much closer to the surface. Uh, of course, that's where people are digging at the moment. It makes much more sense
Mm,
to do so. But in terms of city, what's interesting in Pompeii is that it's a real city. You have every level. You have industries there. You have it was a center of all kinds of bits and pieces. It was fully functioning, whereas it's slightly rude, but not entirely unfair to call Herculaneum a holiday resort. I mean, it was dominated by, the big villas that overlooked the sea. You had a population that was working partly to produce food and to look after the civic infrastructure. But you can't really compare the two places. Why they have changed, apart from size, is that Pompeii has grabbed the attention of people because much of the description of the city and much of the people who work there are English speakers. Is much easier to excavate, and there's something there for everybody. Herculaneum, although it was the first city to be found, is much harder to get at and much more costly. And as we've said, there is an actual modern town sitting on top of it.
mm. Now, next topic I want to talk about is entertainment in the city, and we have found, or we, I'm not saying we, but for lack of better words, it's we have found an amphitheater there, but also when we talked about the baths, and we talked about the boxer. What kind of entertainment did you expect in Herculaneum?
It is curious that not enough. A theatre has been seen, so not an amphitheatre. So you will have seen plays and those types of entertainments. Um, uh, that is a very, very difficult structure because it was the first structure that was found. It's where the women were discovered. It had clearly been damaged significantly in the earthquake, and was in the process of being rebuilt. We can work that out from all the decoration is what's known as fourth style. It's it was all redone fairly soon before Vesuvius went. So you would have seen plays and you would have seen that kind of theatre event done. Much of the work in theatre, because it's still underground and it's not open very often, has been on how it was decorated. It's partly the women, it's partly the statues of the various families, including, unsurprisingly, Marcus Nonius Balbus. Were found there, and that's where a lot of the research has been focused. But again, it's difficult to get there. It's underneath the city. It's a difficult part of the site to visit.
Mm. Now, the last person I want to talk about is the famous fisherman, and it wasn't a very prestigious job being a fisherman, as you
Yeah.
explain in the book. So let's talk a little bit about him as well.
What's interesting about him is, of course, there's supposition, and I've tried to make clear in the book where I'm guessing and where we know. What's interesting is that we can identify that he was a fisherman because of his teeth.
Mm.
And you still see fishermen in the Mediterranean doing the same thing these days. What he does is one side of his mouth, the teeth on one side of his mouth are very much worn down, which is where he was tying up the fishing line, holding the fishing line between his teeth. Um, I find that interesting again because you see a real person. You can also see the muscles, what was left of his muscles, and how he developed. He was clearly a physically strong person. Again, I like him because he doesn't normally trigger a lot of attention from
Right.
historians because he's not
He's just a
important.
common man.
Yeah, he's a man going about his
He's
day-to-day
just an
business.
innocent man.
Yeah, but fishermen were curiously important because they brought food. Going back to the sewer, the were the latrines that were examined. I mean, the amount of fish that was eaten every single day, clearly, I mean, it was everything from bivalves to fish that could be caught from the shore. So you could send the family off with fishing lines to do it. But they also had bigger fish that came from clearly from ships. And again, there's a connection to what you see today. If you go to the markets around southern Italy today, you go first thing in the morning and you see what people have brought, what the Mediterranean gave up for them that day.
Mm. Now, we talked about how a little bit about I mentioned that there it wasn't a very prestigious job, and they were kind of mocked as fishermen, but there were also, and you mentioned this as well, in Rome there were unions. They
Yeah.
unionized in Rome, and if went on strike, it could have a minor catastrophe on if they actually banded together and formed guilds and strikes, etc.
It's interesting seeing the attention that over the last couple of years is starting to be paid to things like unions. It's interesting in Pompeii. The graffiti there is obviously there's much more. It was a much bigger town, but on the water towers there is a poster of one saying that we the fishermen reckon you should vote for so and so in this election. So they were clearly quite powerful. They were emotionally powerful as well. I mean, it was an industry that employed a large amount of the population, everyone will have known at least one fisherman, and so they banded together to work. And I think I quoted from Juvenal. Expensive fish could cost an awful lot of money. So you get rid of this idea of just having a couple of people and a boat and maybe bringing home a few fish to feed the
Teach a
locals.
man how to fish, as the saying goes.
Yeah, yeah. They made money and they sent it all around the area. And if you look at the broader area of Campania, you can see in Pompeii the fish sauce, which came from a particular type of fish. Something like 45% of fish sauce all came from this one retailer. So I mean, fishing was a significant industry.
Hmm. And the last thing we are going to run up soon, and there is a couple of more things I want to talk about. But
Yeah.
you mentioned before the recording that you went to Greece recently, and we
Yes.
talked about how Herculaneum wasn't a very important city. It wasn't significant in the way that, other cities were, but you talked about connections in Greece actually
Yeah.
to Herculaneum. So where does this connection come from?
It's historical. The Campania was settled by Greeks in the 7th, 8th century BCE. It was very Greek in flavor and maintained its Greek flavor for a very long time. The most obvious way is the Palestra, the one of the
And perhaps
huge.
the name of the city itself is an obvious
Sorry?
example. Perhaps the name of the city itself is an obvious example, Herculaneum.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. The layout of the city is very Greek. The Palestra is very Greek in design. The theatre is, I mean, you made a very good point about the amphitheatre, but theatres were still seen as more of a Greek thing, and the city maintained that Greek flavour right up until the end. What I wanted to do when I was in Athens specifically was to look for the Herculaneum women because I'm sort of slightly obsessed with them. And there are I can't remember the full figure. It's around 80 different examples of a Herculaneum women type, and they are displayed in the museum in Athens. And it's interesting that when you go around the museum in Athens, especially moving into the first century BC and first century AD, is how much stuff there looks like stuff in Athens from the start, from in Herculaneum. The museum has the same similar style of statues and even the prosaic pots and pans and what people use on a daily basis. It feels very Greek. And again, if you want to be very prosaic, a lot of the graffiti is written in Greek. It's not written in Latin.
Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is Herculaneum in popular imagination
Yeah.
and in fiction and in, popular memory. So, while we know there's lots of stuff written, about Pompeii for obvious reasons that it's been more famous, but where when it comes to opera, plays, or fictional stories, does Herculaneum future? As you talked a little bit about this as well in the book.
It's curious because the influence of the town is much more significant than it looks at first. because the statues and the figures that emerged from there were hugely important on the German 19th century philosophers and art critics. I'm thinking of Winkelmann specifically. And so, what we think of as Roman and Greek art, a lot of that comes from Herculaneum. I mean, we shouldn't forget that the 85 sculptures, 22 marbles, and 63 bronzes were found at the Villa dei Papyri in Herculaneum. They became known. And so people are subconscious of the town, even if they aren't consciously aware of it, because the way that the figures appear became the standard. In terms of popular culture, much, much, much less well known. I was quite excited that I managed to notice a couple of the statues in the background of a painting of Lawrence Sedema, great 19th century British classical painter. And in one of his paintings, which is now in Australia, right in the background, you have a couple of Herculaneum figures. There's only been one opera, a French opera by Félicien David, which is called Herculaneum, which is pretty good. It's worth listening to. And there was a revival a couple of years ago, and by that I mean 2018, 2019. But
He's
it
so
does,
long ago now.
sorry, yeah,
But
exactly. I think all of that is recent, but then I think of the
mhm,
90s as recent. Um, but it doesn't seem to have grabbed imagination the same way. One of the rivals to Wedgwood pottery was called the Herculaneum
yeah.
pottery. So it is there underneath the surface, but you need to look for it.
Mm. And you mentioned him earlier, and of course we have to talk about one of the most famous archaeologists of the site as well. And I'm sorry if I say his name wrong, Amedeo
No.
Mayuri. So we have to talk about his contribution because it's also a little bit controversial. He's also a bit of a
Yes.
controversial figure as well, that I think is worth going into at the end of this episode.
It is. He's interestingly controversial, and I'm going to start with by saying that he's one of the most brilliant archaeologists of the 20th century, um, and that you don't effectively run a site from the 20s until the 60s
That's
without some of
impressively long
you,
time.
yeah, without some of your decisions being questioned. Um, there is also the question of, like Furtwängler in Germany, that he sailed a bit too close to the fascist wind and was
Yeah.
a bit too close to Mussolini. But on the flip side, you can say he protected the sites and they weren't co-opted into something else. They were very, very well looked after. The
And we have to
reason,
mention that when it came to fascism, especially Italian fascism, which was obsessed with the Roman Empire, like you
yeah,
said,
yeah.
they had unlimited funding for excavation and, of course, discovery of Herculaneum as well. I imagine Pompeii as well, I believe.
Yeah. So, in that sense, reading between the lines, like for Wenger, I don't think he cared one way or another about politics. What he cared about is looking after his sites. Where he has come in for more criticism recently as an archaeologist, I understand why he did what he did, and I understand the criticisms. He wanted to do the Museo Diffuso. He wanted a museum that reflected what life was actually like. So he, for example, in the shops. if they found carbonized walnuts or fruits, he would put those in glass chambers on the counter. In, for example, the men's baths, the changing rooms, a couple were found in there. They'd clearly gone there to hide, and he kept the bodies where they were. All of that is admirable. The difficulty is that he sometimes decorated, if I can put it like that, parts of the site to tell a better story.
Is
And
that
in
still there
doing,
today, or has it been taken down
no,
after?
it's been done very sympathetically, actually. So one of the big things that he did in the mill, in one of the bakeries, they found a bunch of tins of different sizes, and so it's like this is clearly the baking tins, and put them there. It wasn't until comparatively recently that well, first of all, people started to relook at that part of the site, but realized that a professional baker wasn't going to have one tin of each size. And then looking at the notes, realized that they'd come from an apartment above. What they've done to reflect what he did is they've put pictures of of how he decorated the sites. And some of it is theatrical. So before you go into the house of Venus and Aphrodite, if you look up from the street, you can see, the corner of a bed, corner of a table, a bit of color, and it all gives the idea that people have just moved. That's entirely theatrical.
Mm,
It's not real. That's not where things were found.
mm,
Where he does come in for proper criticism is he moved things around to make it look more as he felt it should look. So containers for wine, he put them in places where he thought they should be. Some of the wood that was decorated, that was found, he had it rebuilt to look like he thought it would have looked, but without necessarily saying this is fiction, this is a reconstruction. And in some parts of the site, he moved things around. Just where he thought they would get more of a response from,
mm.
I would say, the audience rather than visitors, because that's how he saw it. Um, it is very, very easy to criticize him for it, and yet it's understandable what he was trying to do. I mean, he's trying to do, what I'm also trying to do. He wanted to make the city real. He wanted to give people a connection. He wanted to make sure people visited Herculaneum and kept visiting Herculaneum.
And where does it stand today and among current archaeologists and historians on the Herculaneum?
People have gone full circle in many ways. He's not, about 4 or 5 years ago, he was being criticized. You could barely open an archaeological paper without seeing him being criticized. People are a bit more, have sobered up, and they recognize what it is that he was trying to do.
Mm,
Now, don't get me wrong, some of the things that he did were appalling. I mean, the set decoration, and I've gone into this in the book. There are some parts where he moved bodies, moved tables. I mean, it is utterly, utterly appalling. And worse than that, he didn't keep full details of what it was that he did. So we're having to guess where some things were found. But he is recognized as the genius that he was. I mean, he put Herculaneum on the map. And while we could never get past the idea that many, 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 many more people go and visit Pompeii than visit Herculaneum. I
Herculaneum
think
is definitely next on my list if I'm going back to Italy.
good. Well, then it's worked. The last figures I've got are 2023, and 500,000 people visited Herculaneum, and 4 million people visited Pompeii. I mean, you can see the difference in number
I mean, I've
there.
already been to Pompeii, so
If you go to Herculaneum, go first thing in the morning because you are likely, if you get in at 8:30 or something, you will have the site pretty much to yourself, and you will never have Pompeii to yourself. And that allows you to wander and think and get a sense of the city as it is.
mm. Now, I'm going to do another comparison to Pompeii, so do forgive me. But one of the things that, especially when I was younger, one of the most gripping things about Pompeii, sorry, I keep saying Pompeii as in Pompeii, but one of the most gripping things about Pompeii was, the bodies that were found there
Yeah.
with the ashes covered over them that they found. Well, how much of this and that kind of grips the imagination. That's what you think about when you think about Pompeii, right? The bodies that were found with people crouching over each other, and it's what first thing that comes to mind. Was this the case with Herculaneum as well? The famous bodies that you see of people dying when the ashes came down and just swallowed you whole. I don't know the science behind this, but was this kind of the same when it came to Herculaneum as well?
It was very different, and you could argue, I would argue, it's better, Herculaneum. The science behind it is to do with the temperature that they died. So it was one of the later pyroclastic flows at a slightly lower temperature in Pompeii. And so it was around 350 degrees Celsius. So that was hot enough to burn everything away. Where we have a sense of clothing and so on in Pompeii, it's due to ash which has landed,
Mm.
and there you've got the famous plaster casts. In fact, I think an exhibition to that has opened in the last couple of months in Pompeii itself. Herculaneum was hit with a much, much higher temperature. It was around 500 degrees Celsius, which means a lot more survived. So people were carbonized instantly. Um, uh, and you have the bodies pretty much as they were. So, for example, the soldier, I'd seen his body, and I mean, it's skeletal and all the rest, but it's recognizable. And you can see, for example, the teeth. I write about he clearly lost some teeth early on. It is patently obvious in that case. You can see it. You don't need very technical apparatus or something to see that. You can see it as is. But because it was carbonized, so much more of the city or a different flavor of the city survived. So you have beds which survived in Herculaneum. The wood has survived. I constantly go on about the child's cot, which has survived, which look as though it came from IKEA, day before yesterday. It's not in the greatest condition, but it's a wooden cot. You've got cabinets that have survived, and the amount of foodstuffs that have survived. One of the reasons that we know so much about their diet, apart from looking at the sewer, is stuff was carbonized. Pomegranates were carbonized. You've got walnuts which were carbonized. You can physically see them, and we in 2026 can look at it and go, I know exactly what that is. It feels the same. And the same with the bread. It is there. It doesn't require plaster of Paris or something else. One of the most interesting things that was found, and I would say found recently, is the oldest olive oil was
Was
dug
it
up.
extra virgin oil?
Yes, it was dug up. It was put in the museum, and then they forgot about it. And it was only found a couple of years ago. Um, and it looks like the bottle of olive oil that you might have on your kitchen counter.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for coming out back on the podcast again. I absolutely enjoyed having this conversation on Herculaneum with you. It's been a great pleasure. And also check out with the other episodes we've done. We did one on the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, and as well, how much do you think about the Roman Empire? I can't believe it's been 3 years already since that episode, and it was a fun meme while it lasted, and I still think about the Roman Empire quite a lot personally. Before you go, of course, where can people find your book? Where are you on social media? If they have further questions, do you only touch the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this topic? So, of course, where can people read more about it in your book? Echoes of Ash, the life in Herculaneum, and and also before that, actually, I want to derail a little bit because you wrote also if you want to visit Herculaneum, what is the best way to? I completely forgot this question. What's the best way to go if you are going to the site? Because you have a little guide at the end of the book as well.
I would say I have a guide at the end of the book, which does so. If you're staying in Naples, the it's easy to get a taxi to do so, or there is a train, the Transvesuvian
I think I
train.
took that train last time.
Yeah, it works. It's easy
It is
enough.
the wooden seat one, right? That I
Sorry?
think I remember it was like a older train with a ton
Yeah.
of wooden seats. Yeah, that I remember.
It's a good train. And the book itself, you can find, should be available in all bookshops and is available on Amazon and other online places. It's in bookshops in the UK. If you want to see more about the site, we were limited, obviously, in the number of photographs that we could put into the book itself. And if you find me on Instagram, you can see many, 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 many more pictures of the site and objects I talk about in the book. I've just done a week of pictures of from Athens of the Herculaneum women. So that might be of interest.
Thank you again so much for coming on. It's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast and to talk with you. This has been Well That Aged Well. We are available on social media under Twitter and Instagram under Well That Aged Well. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars, or you can give us one if you hate the podcast, or if you're on Apple Podcasts, do the same and leave a review. That would be nice. If you're in YouTube, leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.